Normandy, France, June 6, 1944. The metallic taste of blood mixed with seawater as Private James Sullivan pressed himself against the steel obstacles on Omaha Beach. Bodies floated in the crimson-stained surf around him, their life stories reduced to dog tags and waterlogged photographs. The German machine guns above chattered their deadly symphony, each burst sending more men to join the floating dead. James clutched his rifle with numb fingers, the letter from his daughter tucked inside his helmet pressing against his forehead like a talisman. Sarah had written it in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, each letter painstakingly formed. Dear Daddy, I miss you. Mommy cries at night but she doesn't know I hear. I drew you a picture of our house. Come home soon. I love you to the moon and back. He had read it 1,000 times aboard the transport ship, memorizing every misspelled word, every crooked letter. Now, as bullets whined overhead and explosions painted the sky orange, that letter was the only thing keeping him tethered to sanity. Move! 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 Sergeant Henderson screamed, his voice barely audible over the chaos. James forced his legs to respond, stumbling forward through the obstacle-studded water. Men fell around him like puppets with cut strings. Tommy Reeves from Brooklyn took a round to the chest and simply disappeared beneath the waves. Carl Schmidt, who had shared his last cigarette on the boat, collapsed face-first into the sand, his blood pooling around James's boots. The beach seemed impossibly long, a killing field designed by demons. Every yard gained cost lives. James saw Henderson reach the seawall, waving frantically for the men to follow. He was halfway there when something punched him hard in the shoulder, spinning him around. The world tilted, and he found himself on his back, staring at the gray morning sky. He couldn't feel his left arm. Smoke drifted overhead, and for a moment, he thought he could see Sarah's face in the clouds, smiling at him. Hands grabbed him, dragging him toward the wall. Private Chen and Corporal Davis, both bleeding from their own wounds, hauled him to relative safety. A medic appeared, cutting away his uniform, shouting words James couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. The letter fluttered from his helmet, caught by the wind. Panic surged through him, stronger than the pain. That letter was everything. Davis saw it, snatched it from the air, and pressed it back into James's good hand, folding his fingers around it. You're going home, Sullivan, the medic shouted in his ear. Lucky bastard. Keep pressure on that. As they carried him to the evacuation boat, James watched the beach through dimming vision. More men poured ashore, stepping over the dead and dying, pressing forward into the German guns. They would take that beach. They would win. But the cost would haunt the survivors forever. James clutched Sarah's letter to his chest, its paper now stained with his blood and seawater. He had survived. Against all odds, he would make it home to his little girl who still believed her daddy was invincible. The letter had saved him in ways he would never fully understand, a connection to innocence in a world gone mad. Years later, he would frame that blood-stained letter, unable to ever explain to Sarah why he wept when he looked at it, remembering the men who would never read letters from their children again. Ia Drang Valley, Vietnam, November 1965. The jungle breathed with a life of its own, every shadow concealing potential death. Specialist Marcus Green had been in country for 8 months, long enough to know that survival meant trusting your instincts more than your eyes. The radio on his back crackled with static as he moved silently through the elephant grass, his squad spread out in a loose formation behind him. They were looking for a downed pilot, callsign Bluebird 6, somewhere in this green hell where the North Vietnamese army moved like ghosts. Marcus had grown up in rural Georgia, hunting with his grandfather since he could walk. The old man had taught him to read the forest, to move without sound, to see what others missed. Those skills had kept him alive when so many others had been shipped home in aluminum boxes. His squad called him Shadow because he could disappear into terrain that offered no concealment. Now, those skills were all that stood between them and an ambush in enemy-controlled territory. The smell hit him first, acrid and chemical, the signature of recent rocket fire. He raised his fist, freezing his squad in place. Ahead, through the dense foliage, he could see the wreckage of the helicopter, its tail boom twisted like a broken branch. The cockpit was empty, which meant the pilot had survived the crash. But where was he now? Marcus's eyes swept the area, cataloging details others would miss. Disturbed earth near the tree line. A broken branch at shoulder height. A faint drag mark leading into the jungle. He moved forward alone, hand signaling his squad to maintain position. This was the dangerous part, the moment when everything could go wrong. The trail led to a small depression hidden beneath fallen logs. There, semi-conscious and bleeding from a head wound, was Captain Robert Harrison, the missing pilot. His flight suit was torn, and his leg bent at an unnatural angle. More concerning were the voices Marcus could hear approaching from the north, speaking rapid Vietnamese. Enemy soldiers, maybe a platoon, moving toward the crash site. Marcus had seconds to decide. Radio for extraction and give away their position, or try something impossible. He chose impossible. Carefully, he lifted the semi-conscious pilot onto his back, ignoring the man's muffled groan of pain. Then, moving with a patience that seemed superhuman, Marcus began to work his way back toward his squad, step by silent step. The enemy soldiers passed within 10 feet of him, so close he could smell their cigarette smoke. He controlled his breathing, slowed his heartbeat, became part of the jungle itself. It took him 40 minutes to cover 50 yards, every second an eternity. His muscles screamed from the strain of moving so slowly with a full-grown man on his back. Sweat poured down his face, attracting insects he couldn't swat away. When he finally reached his squad's position, Corporal Jenkins nearly shot him, mistaking him for enemy at first. They established a defensive perimeter while Marcus called in a dust-off. The medevac helicopter arrived just as the sun began to set, its rotors beating the air like salvation itself. As they lifted off, Marcus watched the jungle recede below, knowing dozens of enemy soldiers were down there, unaware that he had slipped through their lines like smoke. Captain Harrison would survive, would fly again, would go home to his wife and 3 children. He would never know the name of the specialist who had carried him past certain death, moving with the patience of a predator and the care of a brother. That was fine with Marcus. Some acts of courage happened in silence, witnessed only by the jungle that kept its secrets. Years later, back in Georgia, Marcus would sit in his grandfather's old chair, teaching his own grandson to move through the woods without a sound. He never spoke about Vietnam, about the men he had saved or the nightmares that still woke him at 0300. But when his grandson asked why he was teaching him to hunt, Marcus would simply say, "Sometimes the most important thing is knowing how to move through the world without being seen, and how to carry someone home when they cannot walk themselves." Seoul, South Korea, September 1950. The city burned with a fury that turned night into day. Sergeant William Doc Patterson crouched behind what remained of a stone wall, his medical bag clutched against his chest as explosions rocked the shattered streets of Seoul. He was not supposed to be here, this close to the fighting. Combat medics stayed with the aid station, treating the wounded as they were brought back. But when the radio had crackled with desperate calls from a squad pinned down in the city center, surrounded and running out of time, Doc had grabbed his gear and gone. He was 38 years old, ancient by infantry standards, a country doctor from Tennessee who had been drafted despite his age because the war needed medics more than it needed pride. His wife had begged him not to go, clutching their 16-year-old son, but Doc had understood something she couldn't. There would be boys over there, scared and bleeding, boys the same age as his son, and someone needed to bring them home. If it couldn't be their fathers, then it would be him. The building ahead was barely standing, its facade blown away to reveal rooms like a doll's house open for inspection. Somewhere inside, Lieutenant Morrison and what was left of his squad were trapped, unable to move because of casualties. Doc ran, keeping low, as sniper fire cracked around him. He didn't think about the danger. He thought about Morrison, 22 years old, who had shown him photographs of his girl back home. He thought about Private Kowalski, who wrote poetry in his foxhole. He thought about all the boys who had no business being in this hell. He found them on the second floor, in what had been someone's apartment. Morrison lay against a wall, his abdomen soaked with blood, his face gray. 3 others were wounded, and 2 men were dead, covered with someone's jacket. The remaining soldiers looked at Doc with expressions of disbelief and desperate hope. He went to work immediately, his trained hands moving with practiced efficiency. Pressure dressing for Morrison. Morphine. Plasma. The lieutenant grabbed his wrist, tried to speak, but Doc shushed him like he was a child. Save your strength, son. We're getting you out of here. But how? The stairs had collapsed, and enemy forces held the street below. Doc looked around the ruined apartment, his mind racing through possibilities. The building next door was closer to friendly lines, separated by maybe 15 feet of open air over a 3-story drop. In peacetime, it would be impossible. In war, impossible became merely difficult. He found a heavy wooden beam, charred but solid, and with the help of the able-bodied soldiers, they positioned it across the gap. It was barely wide enough to walk across, and it swayed ominously. Doc went first, carrying his medical bag and a rope. He didn't look down, focusing instead on the rough wood beneath his feet, the way he had crossed his daddy's creek on fallen logs as a boy. He made it across, secured the rope, and one by one, they brought the wounded over. Morrison had to be carried, unconscious now, 2 men bearing him across that narrow bridge while enemy fire kicked up splinters around them. Doc stood at the far end, pulling each man to safety, his face set in grim determination. They made it to friendly lines as dawn broke, a ragged group of survivors emerging from the rubble like ghosts from a tomb. Morrison survived his wounds, would go home to marry his girl and name his first son William. Kowalski would publish his poems, dedicating the collection to a Tennessee doctor who had risked everything for strangers. But Doc never thought of himself as a hero. To him, he had simply done what any father would do, crossing an impossible distance to bring his boys home. Years later, retired and tending to his small-town practice, Doc would sometimes wake in the night, feeling phantom explosions, smelling smoke and blood. But he would also remember the faces of the boys he had saved, and he would know that some bridges, no matter how impossible, were worth crossing. Because on the other side waited someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father, and they deserved every chance to make it home. Verdun, France, October 1916. The mud of Verdun was unlike anything that had existed before the war, a supernatural substance that seemed to hunger for men's souls. It wasn't just dirt mixed with water. It was earth churned by months of artillery bombardment, mixed with blood, pieces of equipment, and the dissolved remains of thousands of men. Lieutenant André Moreau had been in the trenches for 6 weeks, an eternity in this meat grinder where companies were fed into the German guns and reduced to nothing in hours. André came from Lyon, where his family had made wine for 3 generations. He had studied philosophy at university, had planned to teach, had believed in the glory of France and the nobility of sacrifice. The war had taught him different lessons, written in the language of gas attacks and machine gun fire. Now he believed in nothing except the men in his platoon, these boys from farms and factories who looked to him for leadership even as he led them towards certain death. The order came down at dawn, attack at 0600 hours, objective to take the German salient 500 meters ahead. André looked at the objective through his periscope and felt his stomach turn. 500 meters of open ground, already carpeted with the bodies from yesterday's assault. The German position was a fortress of concrete and steel, untouched by the artillery barrage that was supposed to soften it. He turned to his men, saw their faces, young and old, brave and terrified, and knew that most of them would die in the next hour. Among them was Private Henri Bouchard, barely 18, who had lied about his age to enlist. The boy reminded André of his younger brother, the same eager eyes and quick smile. Henri had no family left, his parents and sister had died when their village was shelled. André had taken him under his wing, taught him how to survive in this hell, promised him they would both make it home, though he knew it was a lie. Now, as the whistle blew and they went over the top, André kept Henri close, trying to shield him with his own body. The German machine guns opened up immediately, their stuttering roar drowning out the screams of dying men. André's world narrowed to the shell crater ahead, a temporary shelter in a landscape of death. He dove into it, pulling Henri down with him. Around them, the platoon was being torn apart. Sergeant Dubois, who had survived since 1914, fell without a sound. Corporal Laurent, who sang opera in the trenches, was cut in half by a shell. The crater filled with men, the living huddling among the dead as artillery pounded the earth. They were pinned down for 16 hours, unable to advance or retreat. Henri was hit twice, once in the leg and once in the chest. André held him as the boy's blood soaked into the mud, mixing with rainwater and the filth of war. Henri was crying, not from pain but from fear, calling for his mother, asking André if he had done well, if he was brave enough. André lied to him with his last words, promised him medals and parades, promised him that someone would remember, that his sacrifice meant something. The boy died as the sun set, his last breath a whisper that could have been a prayer or simply a sigh of relief. When darkness finally allowed a retreat, André carried Henri's body back through the mud, refusing to leave him for the rats and the artillery. Of the 60 men who had climbed out of the trench that morning, 11 made it back. The German salient remained untaken, as it would for another month, until enough bodies had piled up to serve as stepping stones across no man's land. André wrote to Henri's aunt, the boy's only remaining relative, constructing elaborate lies about heroism and quick deaths. He kept the promise he had made in that shell crater, filing reports that earned Henri posthumous recognition, ensuring the boy's name appeared on a memorial somewhere, a small immortality carved in stone. The war would grind on for 2 more years, consuming millions more, but André never forgot the weight of Henri's body in his arms, or the promise he had made to a dying boy that his death had meant something. Even if it was a lie, it was a necessary one, perhaps the only truth that mattered in a war where truth itself had become another casualty, buried deep in the mud of Verdun. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, August 1942. The jungle was dying. Corporal Michael Jong could feel it in the oppressive heat, see it in the diseased foliage that grew despite the constant shelling. Henderson Field had become a symbol, a piece of coral and jungle that men on both sides were willing to die for because the map said it mattered. Mike understood the strategic importance, how the airfield controlled the sea lanes, how victory here could turn the tide of the Pacific War. But understanding strategy didn't make the mosquitoes stop biting, didn't cure the malaria that was killing more men than Japanese bullets. Mike's parents had emigrated from China before he was born, settling in San Francisco where his father had opened a small restaurant. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, Mike had been one of the first to enlist, driven by a need to prove his loyalty to a country that still looked at his face and saw the enemy. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now fought Japanese soldiers while his own relatives were being rounded up into internment camps back home. But he wore the Marine Corps uniform with pride, had earned his corporal's stripes through courage under fire, and his squad trusted him without reservation. Tonight they held a position at the perimeter, a hastily dug foxhole line that stood between the Japanese forces massing in the jungle and the airfield behind them. Intelligence said a major attack was coming, that the enemy would throw everything at them in one desperate push to retake the field. Mike's squad consisted of 8 Marines, all that remained of a company that had landed on this cursed island with 180 men 6 weeks ago. They were veterans now, hardened by combat, bound by shared trauma that made them closer than brothers. The attack came at 0400, announced by the shriek of Japanese artillery and the haunting sound of bugles in the darkness. They came in waves, screaming banzai, their bayonets flashing in the muzzle flashes. Mike's squad opened fire, their Garans and Thompson submachine guns cutting down the first wave, then the second. The Japanese kept coming, stepping over their own dead, driven by a fanaticism Mike couldn't comprehend. His squad fought with the mechanical precision of men who knew this was their last stand, that if they broke, the airfield would fall, and everything they had sacrificed would be for nothing. Private Davidson went down first, a Japanese officer's sword nearly severing his head. Then Gonzalez, shot through both lungs but still firing until his last breath. The line contracted, pulling back to the secondary positions, trading space for time. Mike found himself next to Lieutenant Williams, the young officer who had landed on this beach full of academy ideals and textbook tactics. The jungle had burned that away, leaving something harder and more real. Together, they coordinated the defense, directing fire, calling in artillery support that landed close enough to shower them with jungle debris. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of crimson that seemed appropriate for the slaughter, the Japanese attack faltered and broke. The survivors retreated into the jungle, leaving behind hundreds of bodies in front of Mike's position. Of his squad, only he and Williams remained unwounded. Thompson had taken a bullet through the calf but kept fighting. Harrison's left hand was mangled by a grenade fragment. Kelly and Martinez were dead, their bodies lying in the foxhole they had refused to abandon. Mike stood in the gray morning light, surveying the carnage, feeling nothing but an exhaustion so profound it threatened to drag him into the earth. Reinforcements were arriving, fresh-faced Marines who stared at the battlefield with the same mix of horror and fascination that Mike remembered from his own first combat. Williams clapped him on the shoulder, tried to say something about medals and commendations, but Mike just shook his head. There would be no parades for this, no glory in the killing they had done to survive. The airfield still stood, and that would have to be enough. Months later, when Mike finally rotated home, he would stand in his father's restaurant and not know how to explain where he had been or what he had seen. The customers would thank him for his service, seeing only the uniform and the ribbons, not understanding that the boy who had left was gone forever, replaced by a man who woke screaming from dreams of bugles and bayonets. But he would smile and nod, because some battles couldn't be shared, some prices couldn't be explained to those who hadn't paid them. Guadalcanal had taken 8 men from his squad, but it had taught him something profound about the cost of freedom, about the weight of duty, and about the terrible mathematics of war where victory was measured not in glory but in survival. Years later, when his own son asked him about the war, Mike would pause, weighing truth against protection, and finally say only that he had served with good men in hard times, and that was enough. The rest, the bodies and the blood and the weight of those who hadn't made it home, he would carry in silence until the day he joined them, answering a final bugle call that had echoed in his dreams for decades.